we got all these floppy disks. It's like, yes, but look at this. One zip drive. That's all we'll ever need.
Yeah. I remember on the PC screwing it into the parallel port. It was like a printer port.
That's what this show should be, is reminiscing about old...
Remember when?
Old
tech.
Oh, exactly.
Welcome to Archispeak, the podcast that talks about what it's like to work in the profession of architecture.
Welcome to episode 108 of the Archispeak podcast. I'm Neil Pan.
I'm Evan Troxel.
And I'm Cormac Phelan.
And this episode of Archispeak is sponsored by Arcat and Charette Venture Group and also BQE Software. We'll talk more about each of them later in the show.
All right, so let's get right into the topic this week. And we got a great email from a listener of the show, and I love the title of it. It was Universal Intern Problem. And I think we all kind of shook our heads. Yeah, we've got interns are a problem.
Yeah.
and yes, everybody deals with this, so it is universal. No, so the idea behind this email is really like office standards, and I thought this was an interesting topic because it seems to be like they're saying, is this a universal problem? So let me quickly read their email, and then we can chat about this stuff. So I'm an architecture student. I have an internship / part-time job at a firm, and I have been with the firm for 4 months. And this week was the first time a supervisor has bothered to go over office-specific CAD standards, sheet layouts, standard practices, etc. So they say, fortunately, that they have a background in CAD and drafting, but feel that they could have been infinitely more productive if there was a firm-wide specific manual of some kind. So there would be fewer red lines on check sets, fewer questions, etc. And so they asked around if other classmates of theirs had manuals, and they said that they didn't either. And so then they're asking, is this the norm in the profession? Wouldn't it save a ton of time and headache if firms assembled even a cursory one sheet addressing firm-specific drawing standards? And so as an intern architect, I know my productivity, learning curve, and confidence would climb exponentially with something like that. So they wanted to know what we thought about that. So there's a lot packed into that question, but I think overall, this is a topic that's kind of a plague for a lot of offices because what I call, this is a chicken and the egg problem. Like, who has time to make this stuff and do all the work? But at the same time, the productivity suffers because this stuff doesn't exist in most firms. So I guess we'll just open it up there and see where this goes. But I think that this is a topic about onboarding, standards, expectations. There's so much that we could go off on here that it is it's a really good question. So thanks to our listener for asking it.
Let me ask you this first. Do you have such a manual in each of, I'll start us off and say, yes, we do have a manual in our office. So what about you guys?
We do. And it's, so to me, there's actually, it's a way bigger question because we have Revit standards and we've got CAD standards. But to me, this starts with expectations of what an intern is going to do. It talks about like them having a specific list of things that they're going to accomplish and get exposure to while they're in an office during their internship. And then how do they get onboarded? Like, what's the right way? Or do they just show up one day and then you scramble to put them onto some task and then you continue to struggle with that throughout their internship?
Well, we're saying the internship, and that's probably, onboarding an intern is probably harder than onboarding a seasoned employee or somebody who's had a little bit more experience.
I would argue that on the surface, yes, but in practice, a seasoned employee is more trouble because they come with so much
baggage,
architectural office baggage.
Well, exactly.
This is the way we did things, and that usually conflicts.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with it. Because I'll give you a good example, and that would be me. I went from a firm that I had worked there for 6 years, and I was trying to help them develop some standards, and then just never really happened. And so there was really no intern onboarding of any kind. And, when we talk about onboarding, just if people are scratching their head on what onboarding is, it's when, you have a new employee come in and you indoctrinate them into the standards, ways and practices, means and methods of doing how you get along within the firm, the standards, exactly what, he was saying in his email. Because I didn't have standards from my old office, I developed my own standards. And so I come into a new firm, a firm that's been around for, 100 years. And assuming that they have standards, and we do, in an onboarding process, and we do, are they perfect? No, nobody's really are, but it's better if you actually have some place to start. But so I did, however, didn't do my onboarding, this particular firm, for probably about a month. And so for a month, I was somewhat operating as if my standards that I developed were good enough to keep going. As you saw these drawings that I started to develop come into fruition, and I started to compare them with other projects that were going out of the office, I noticed that they needed a lot of work, because what I was used to, I was either providing too much information and too much detail in one location where they actually put it in other locations, and so on. So it was a challenge for me as somebody who's now got 17 plus years of experience to come into a new firm and integrate into their process without having the opportunity to go through the onboarding process that first day. And I'll tell you a story of another firm that I know of that actually has really good onboarding standards where, and I don't know if they still do, so I'm going to say the name of the firm. And so there's a firm in Nashville, it's LRK, Looney, Ricks, and Kiss, architecture firm, big firm, kind of the size of, like, say, the firm I work for, a couple hundred people kind of thing. Evan works for the big, mega, crazy. I think you guys like 500-600, something like that.
No.
Oh,
like 330.
So they're about that size. And so when you start working for LRK, and this comes from, I had several friends who work there, and I don't know if the firm still does the same thing. So if anybody is out there that listens to the show that actually works for them, let me know if they still actually do this. So they actually have what's something kind of called like the LRK Academy or whatever. So you come in there, and for a week, before you do anything else, the very first day is obviously the paperwork and stuff like that. But for a full week, you're actually in training to do things the LRK way. I thought it was great because you learn the CAD standards, you learn the BIM standards, you learn, depending on what level you are, you learn what your roles and responsibilities are. And they actually go through all of the different roles and responsibilities of each of the level, so you know what is expected of you now. But if you want to grow within the firm, you should know what is expected of you in the future. So say if you're coming in as a project intern, well, what does it mean to move up to the next level of, maybe a project architect or, senior project architect, or what is a project manager? And so they give you every role and responsibility so you know who to ask, what to ask, where to go, where are the resource libraries, where are the design standards, where are the graphic standards, all of these different things, so that each person coming in, regardless of their educational experience or their time within an office, knows exactly what it takes to work at LRK. And I thought that was great. And I never understood why other firms never did that. And I've worked for a few other firms that they never met a standard that they liked. It was just the opposite of this one experience, or this one story that I was told by a friend of mine who used to work there.
Well, you just described the ideal situation, right?
Yeah, that's the ideal situation, but...
Well, and that's what Apple does. And Neil, you probably know about this. I mean, Apple set up, when Steve Jobs was still there, he hired like a dean from Yale to come in and start Apple University to do exactly the same thing. And there's nothing written about it. Like, they don't share anything. So it's just kind of speculation at this point. But it was set up to do exactly that. He knew he wasn't going to be there. And so he wanted to set into motion a university, a training system, so that, and I don't think that this really had to do with with the day-to-day stuff as it had to do with this is big company stuff. This is where the company's going. This is how we do things. This is why we do things. And he put that into place. And I'm sure it's probably trickled down to lots of other areas within the company. But it was one of those things where he knew, again, he wasn't going to be there for long. And so he wanted to kind of set in stone what the Apple way was, and so that everybody was on board with the same foundation.
Well, I think to answer kind of quickly, part of the question is, I don't think this is the norm in the profession. Although I will say, since most of the firms in this profession are smaller firms, I think that the smaller the firm, the less likely you're going to see that they've had the time or spent the effort to put together a quote-unquote official manual. And so we each now, or myself, joined a firm again almost a year ago, and it's a larger firm of, 125 or so people, plus or minus. And they do have, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we do have a manual. The only issue that sometimes, so I guess where I want to go with this a little bit is having a manual is great, and there's definitely no substitute for not having it. But at the same time, it can be somebody's full-time job to keep it up as well. Yep. And so what often happens is, yes, you may have this manual, and yes, it was a good starting point, but it was forgotten and left alone. And so even though you may get it on day one, nobody's really maybe explaining it to you because they don't have that onboarding process that you described, Cormac, in the ideal situation that does exist apparently. But
maybe
it gets maybe. And then it gets forgotten and things change, and then the manual doesn't get updated. And so a lot of that information sometimes will get out of date. And then you almost have a larger problem, right? Because now you have newer things that people are doing. Or I'll tell you, like in my firm, we have two floors in this building, and you find that a group of people on the first floor do things slightly differently than the group of people on the second floor.
We have exactly the same issue.
Yeah. So
different studios all do things differently. Different groups within studios do things differently.
Yes.
Right. So even though as our listener asked, is this normal? I think maybe the answer is yes, it is normal to not have this, but even when you do have it, it doesn't solve all of the problems.
Right. I mean, I'll tell you that depending on which project manager you work with, you may get something slightly different, or somebody's like, well, that detail that they draw there, I don't really like that kind of detail. I know that's a standard office detail, but we've changed that detail and we're going to do this.
Yep.
It starts to waver on personal preferences. It starts to waver on experiences people had at other firms. Yeah, so it's not, so changing it from universal intern problem to universal architecture problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Is probably a better way to explain it.
Yeah. Who knew that everybody was so frustrated with this?
Yeah.
We all did.
Well, I will say right now in our office, we're going through an effort we have older standards, and we're trying to go through and update them so that we can because we're going through a bigger effort now of an integrated design practice. And with the integrated design practice, it means that everybody really does need to be on the same sheet of music when it comes to doing all of these different things. And whether it's what are your deliverables, what are the expectations of the people within the project, I mean, all sorts of different things. And right now, it's the standards that one particular division within the firm has versus another one is almost non-existent. There is no comparison between them. People who are doing like our student life type work is doing something different than our arts and sciences type stuff. And so there is no real standard because we're delivering two completely different types of projects. And so it's a struggle. And so I think it's again, going back to changing the title of this show from intern to architect to like architecture problem.
Oh, it's a lot of businesses actually. Yeah, it's complicated.
Well, yeah.
And I think even adding onto that is one of the difficult things about standards, and Neil alluded to this with just talking about how fast things change, is that change is constant and people have good ideas. And so how do you make room for that kind of stuff? I mean, there are better ways to do things happening all the time. And if people are on the lookout for that kind of stuff because they're interested in it, they have to have the freedom and the safety to like bring up ideas on how things get better. And then how do you roll that out to a company? It is a difficult problem.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, let's take a second out and talk about our first sponsor for this show, and that is our longtime sponsor, Arcat. And so Arcat asks the question, what's the one thing that we all do in our practice? And the answer is we search the internet for content. So what they want to tell us is that arcat.com is the online resource devoted to bringing content to the building professional. They have huge libraries that you can access, and they do not hit you up for subscriptions. There's no fees, and they won't make you register to download the content. So we've all been there. You finally find the right file. You get blocked with a registration pop-up, and you think, thanks for wasting my time. I will find it somewhere else. Arcat's BIM library is really second to none and available in just about any format that you need. In fact, their entire BIM library is formatted for the last 5 versions of Revit. Their CAD detail library has thousands of CAD details, and if you need specs, the Arcat library is the most consistent library you will find. Every single spec is written in the 3-part format. And I see this question come up all the time. What are you guys using for specs? How do you guys write specs? And I think the answer typically from me is go to Arcat. Yeah. There's so much more on their site, including catalogs, videos, and Spec Wizard. You can go to arcat.com to download their app, and you can check it all out. It's a great free resource. You do not, again, have to register to use it. So check out Arcat today. That's arcat.com. What are you waiting for? Do not forget that you can also provide feedback on their website. On the right side of every page, there's a button, and you can make your suggestions to help make Arcat better. And we would like it also if you let them know that Archispeak sent you. So thanks again, Arcat, for sponsoring this episode of Archispeak, and let's get back to the conversation. So just to kick things back off here, can I go a little bit of a different direction? All right. So one of the things that, and Neil, what format is your guys' manual in? And I guess the question's for both of you guys.
Ooh, format.
Yeah. Is it like on a web page? Is it a PDF? Is it a printed out like 3-ring binder? How is it delivered to you guys?
Oh, okay. It is a 3-ring binder.
Cormac, what about yours?
All right. So I'm going to tell you what it was and what it is becoming.
Okay.
So what it was a both in PDF format that lived in our Office Standards folder on our Office Standards drive, and when you got there, they gave you a printed out version.
Okay. So
that you could kind of follow along when they were doing it. What we're actually doing now, I'm kind of excited about this, is so we've developed this kind of internal. I don't know how to explain it as well as they do, but essentially it's very similar to how we use Trello and things like that, where we do an internal communication where we post thoughts, we post ideas, we share standards, we share links to, like how we pull together graphic stuff, we share news about recent proposals or interviews that we've had. People can post questions. I'm not going to say what it's called.
So an intranet.
So it's an intranet, but it's kind of like the Internet 2.0 type version. So it's very similar to how it's kind of like it's an internet, it's an intranet and a chat room and everything, and
it's Facebook.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a free-flowing form of information, but it's searchable. It's integrated into like all of our project folders and stuff, so you're able to not only just have conversations and send links and stuff, but you're also able to like pull up project information all within one location rather than having to kind of like go from window to window to window to try to do things. And I think that that's going to be interesting because, say for instance, I'm working on a parapet detail and the parapet butts up against an existing building and I need an expansion joint detail. Does anybody have any experience that they could maybe share with me about that kind of condition. So not only are they going to potentially send somebody information about or a link to that, but they're also going to probably do some, hopefully what comes out of it is they're going to share some experiences about, well, we had this condition and we drew it this way, but the contractor or the manufacturer said, maybe to do it this way. And so we started to work that way out. Or they'll say, okay, well, they installed it exactly the way I drew it, but it failed a month later because we forgot to do this or this. And so that they could have the conversation to build off of other people's experiences and their own base knowledge of things to help other people grow with it. And so that's where we're going. And so that's actually going to be a big part of how we onboard people, is having to let them know how to understand this resource.
Read the intranet. Yeah. I the reason I asked is that that's a great example right there, because you guys both showed two very different approaches to trying to answer this problem. And I think we could probably all agree that a printed resource, the problem with that is that it's not a living document.
No.
Or you have to start swapping out sheets, or you've got to print out new versions every once in a while so that it is current. And to me, this is, again, going back to what you said, Neil, earlier about how this kind of has to be someone's full-time job. And I would even add to that depending on what is in this document, it needs to be someone who actually does the work, who writes it, because a lot of times that gets offloaded onto somebody in some type of administrative position, and they don't even know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so this living document, I think, Cormac, what you're talking about is exactly what everybody wants, is like a common knowledge base that is searchable. Search is like the biggest part of it, right?
Yeah.
So when the problem arises, I can search for the answer for it. And you could find out what the ASG way is to do that.
Yeah. So if you have a question, like pre-show, we were talking about Neil's, I'm kind of excited to listen about the development of this throughout future shows and stuff. But Neil's dipping the toe in the BIM.
That's right.
He's taking the leap. But a resource like what we're working on, and we're about to fully launch. They've been beta testing it, and we're about to launch it firm wide. So if Neil's like, hey, how do I launch BIM, or how do I launch Revit? Sorry, BIM. How do I launch Revit? And then somebody like quickly emails back, you press the button, kind of thing. But I'm trivializing. But I mean, I know he knows how to do that. I'm just kidding, Neil. But,
sure about that?
Maybe not.
It's okay.
But
double click.
I'm guessing you know how to double click an icon. But I mean,
you don't pull out the stone tablet and the rock.
You don't use the chisel on the monitor.
Don't
Neil.
do the chisel on the monitor. Okay, I'll remember that.
that.
I'm going to take a note about that now.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Wait, hold on. Do you hear the chiseling? He's taking a note.
I'm looking for a chisel effect.
I'm looking for my tablet so I can.
One of the big things with this is that we have people working in our offices who've been there a really long time, and they have never written anything down.
Right.
And to me, this is like one of the main ideas here is that if you want to stop getting bugged with what you might call stupid questions,
right,
because you've never taken the time to tell people the way that they need to do things in this office, then you need to write this stuff down. And there's a great article that I've read quite a while ago that kind of opened my eyes to this, and it was from Derek Sivers, who's the guy who started CD Baby, which was like the first independent online music company outside of iTunes. That my band released our album through them and got it on iTunes, and it was this amazing thing. And he was running this show by himself, and he was going crazy because the market was taking off, and he was hiring all kinds of people. And he realized, and it's bolded in this article, and we'll paste the link to this in our show notes for this episode. And he said, I had to make myself unnecessary to the running of my company. And he realized that he had to change into a delegation mindset instead of, I've got to do everything kind of a mindset.
Right.
And the only way that's going to happen, I think this really applies to the small firms who are listening to this show, is I don't care how many employees you have. If you want someone else to not just constantly bombard you with, how do we do this? How do we do that? How do you want this done? Write it down.
Right.
And then or even better, have someone else write it down. if you do have another person, and tell them to write it down so that they own it too. And if the more the people can contribute to this living document, the better. And if it isn't a living document, if it's a paper thing, it is so easy to swap this out with like an online wiki style thing that can become a living document so that the information is not outdated as soon as it's printed.
Right.
I mean, I think that is super important.
One of the things that I think is that would be of value, because you said it best, because there's a lot of people who they've been there a while and they don't really, they're a great knowledge base, but they have to go in and really kind of, you got to like pull it out of them to get there. And I think
how do you do that? That's another show.
I think one of the things that they could do, especially in a searchable wiki type thing, is being able to kind of have them write either a white paper about even lessons learned of a particular project, or maybe write an after action review of something as simple as like, we drew a detail. And I use this example, but drew this detail, got into the bid documents, went out to the site. They started to build it the way that we had it detailed, but we realized that we couldn't build it that way, and this is why. And so they're going to go to ARCAT, and they're going to pull down a detail, and they may not know how to modify it directly to a specific issue within your project. So they're going to put the detail on the drawings, and they're going to send it out, and it's going to go out to the field, and it may not necessarily work. Well, how do you make it work, and how do you modify it? And just doing that is a great way to help somebody, especially newer people, learn how to take what they find when they're doing like a detail search or spec search or something like that, and tailor make it to their particular project. And so that right there alone, just teaching people how to modify details to work for what they're doing, rather than reinventing a detail, but modifying a detail, is a great thing to do.
Well, speaking of that, this is a good opportunity to take a short break and talk about our other sponsor for this episode, because they might be able to help you do some of these things, and that is Charette Venture Group. Charette Venture Group helps design firms grow into strong businesses. Whether you're interested in an a la carte consulting or CVG's unique ongoing investment model, they can help you reduce stress and improve profits. Recently, they announced the merger with R.M. Klein Consulting. AIA fellow Rena Klein, the author of The Architect's Guide to Small Firm Management, has brought her long-standing consulting practice into Charette Venture Group and now serves as the group's vice president for investment partnerships. For more information on how Charette can help you and your design firm grow, visit them at www.charettevg.com, or you can even call them at 515-207-2422. So check out charettevg.com and see how they can help your firm grow into a stronger business. And thank them for sponsoring this episode of Archispeak.
So getting back to the original question, one of the things that they ask is, wouldn't it save a ton of time and headache if firms assembled even a cursory one sheet addressing firm-specific drawing standards? And I know that one of the things that firms really struggle with or complain about is how people aren't as productive as they could be. And I think a lot of it stems from not having this kind of simple information available at people's fingertips,
right,
so that they can be doing things the firm's way. And so, I mean, how do you address this in your office, Cormac?
One of the things that we had with the very first firm that I ever worked for, now it was purely about CAD and CAD standards, but we did have a one sheet on what our line weights were, what our layers were supposed to be, and things like that. Now, as obviously we've moved into BIM and people are using things like Revit or other methods, I don't know what any of the other methods are. I'm just so used to Revit that I have no idea if there's any other BIM
there
stuff.
There might be some.
If any of them would like to sponsor the show, we would be glad to talk about all the different options.
Absolutely. But so it's made it more complicated to just do a one sheet. But where I was going with that is that firms know, or should know, what they want the final product to look like. And that's what, and I make this argument all the time, is until we start to, everybody's starting to use BIM, or they're knee deep into BIM and they've been doing it for a decade and a half or so. Until we're using BIM to its full extent by actually building off of the model, everybody knows that we're going to have to build off of 2D plans. So everybody should know what their deliverables should and want to look like. And that's how we need to train people is, okay, how you get to this end result may differ between project managers or different project architects and stuff like that, or you may find different details off online, but all of that's great. But here's what I want it to look like at the very end, because I need to make sure that you're including all of the proper detail, all of the proper information, all of the proper CYA information that is almost as important, if not sometimes more important, than the actual information you're putting on the drawings. Because just as long as it's not my fault.
Yeah, look over there.
Exactly. But I mean, there's basic levels of things that need to be on documents, regardless of what type of project type there are. And to fit, because you're going to tailor fit everything. But as long as you know you need general, like, let's just take the reflected ceiling plan. You're going to need general notes on your reflected ceiling plan of things that are best practices that you use in your firm and that you've seen and learned throughout your construction administration process that you know are things that are just general ideas that you need to get across, that don't need to be detailed, don't need to be drawn up, but need to at least just be there as a note that says, you're going to center all of the devices in the middle of your 2x2 ceiling grid or whatever it is that you have for your standard. And then you know that you're going to have graphic details. And so you're going to need a graphic legend. Then you're going to have specific details, specific notes. And you're going to have a specific keynote legend, if that's what your office does. So your office should have a standardized of this is what our deliverables need to look like and information that needs to be there. And I think in this kind of ever-changing living document type thing, as long as we teach them what the end product is, all of that information that comes ahead of it can come from different sources, can come from different things. And as long as it's fit right to the end document, you should be good. I spent a lot of time actually talking about that. This is what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah. There was a really interesting article on Architect Magazine written by Michael Kilkelly, and he has a cool website called ArcSmarter, so a little plug for him. You might check that out. If you follow the link, I'll put it in the show notes, to a article about Canon Design's hospital. It's a hospital in Canada, and it's a 2 million square feet, $1.5 billion, 3.6 million square foot new hospital. So biggest healthcare project in North America. And one of the things he talked about was the getting everybody on the same page. And I thought it was really interesting how they basically did what we talked about earlier with the whole Apple University and the firm that you were talking about that was it Nashville?
Yeah.
So what they did was nobody was even allowed to open the Revit model until they had been through this, I think it's a 2-week class.
Which is fantastic.
And the reason why is, I mean, when you have, they talk about the schedule, they talk about that there's different levels of users and all this stuff, but if you screw that Revit model up, right, there's huge problems that could come out of that. And so basically they're starting from the beginning, and again, I would just call this maybe project onboarding, not necessarily office onboarding, but they actually had a training session on how to open the Revit model. And then it got deeper and deeper, like how to actually work on it and what all the different work sets were and how the information was being managed, which is super important for everybody who touched that model to understand so that they didn't mess it up.
Right.
I mean, how many times if you opened a model, Cormac, and something that you drew yesterday is gone because somebody else thought it wasn't important and they deleted it. I mean, that happened in our office just this week. I heard a story about someone's casework getting deleted because one reason or another. Or every day that I opened up my model when I was working on elementary school, the main stair was deleted because it was attached to something else that somebody didn't want to see in one plan, and they didn't realize that they're deleting an entire 3-story stair out of the model. I mean, this kind of stuff, it just sucks the life out of you as you're rebuilding this stuff or trying to go back into old models and pull data, copy and paste it out. And so this is what we're talking about, right? This is where this firm kind of implemented a onboarding process for the project to make sure that everybody knew what the hell they were doing. And I thought that this was a great example of doing the right thing. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
So, Evan, one of the things I did last summer when I was starting up 3 different projects all at the same time with 3 different people plus myself is that I had us all go to a conference room and sit down, and we spent an hour because none of us had all worked together before.
Yeah.
I myself being new, of course, and really not knowing the standards, but the 3 others but none of us had all worked together. And so since we were creating 3 separate projects, but they were all for the same client and they were all going to be done at the same time. So they all had to have a level of consistency between the 3 of them. Mm-hmm. And so what I tried to do to solve this problem, as I mentioned earlier in the show, we do have some office standards and it does come in a binder. And I think there's a PDF of it all on the server somewhere in the defaults. But I called a meeting between the 4 of us and we all sat down and talked about how the drawings are going to go together, because this was a relatively complex sort of process of doing a multifamily project, and how we were going to address this was not a Revit thing. This was all just done in AutoCAD, like animals, I know, but savages, yes. And so how was that going to work and get noted consistently and put together, and the naming standards and everything.
Right.
And so I know this is kind of trying to answer our listener's question, but taking this from a very small level of, okay, one project team, how do we solve this issue to make us all more productive? That's the way that I did that.
Yeah.
And then that worked actually pretty well. And so I think what needs to happen to try and help this and help other firms out there is you need to just take that same idea, or at least this is my suggestion, and just grow that, right? Scale it up a little bit. And I think what we mentioned earlier in the show about having a living document is critical.
Yeah, it's got to be. It's got to be.
And that way, and then maybe it's something that gets returned to every month or every quarter or something. And there's a lunch time talk, or maybe it's, I like the thing that you were talking about earlier, Cormac, where you have a little wiki or something where you can post things. Hey, this is a good way to do this. Maybe we should change our standard to include this now because we've learned something new, or the last build of Revit has a new feature in it or something that we can all begin to implement. And I think the issue that I see, at least in our office, and I think this is also universal as well, is that the sharing of information is difficult in firms. And this goes exactly to what our listener was talking about, is how do we share that information? Because if there are no drawing standards written in a manual, how are you supposed to learn? And our poor listener didn't get that for 4 months. So how do you speed up that process? And I think requesting it is one. I think that when you start at a firm, you should ask those questions right off the bat. Like, how do you want this drawn? What layers should I be doing? Or how do I open up the Revit model so it doesn't get screwed up? Those are all things that you have to do as the intern or the new employee coming in with the experience. Because I agree with you, Evan, as you mentioned earlier, that's a huge, probably a bigger problem than the new person who doesn't really know.
Well, what's interesting to me is that there's also the empowerment idea here, where if you give people information, they're empowered to do the thing without hiding. And what I mean by that is I see a lot of employees, typically the older ones, who don't actually draw in Revit, but the team would probably benefit from them coming into the model and being able to check things, is they just say, I don't want to screw things up. So they hide behind the idea of being technically illiterate potentially. And instead of the company empowering them with training to go in and get into the model and be able to look at things without screwing it up, they kind of just let them hide behind that, and they say, yeah, you really shouldn't get in there because you might screw things up. And then there's like this layer of fear. I don't know if you guys have seen this in the office, but there's this layer of fear, like, oh, I don't want to go in there. I got yelled at once for screwing something up, instead of the company or a training group or something taking the time to actually get in there and teach that person how to do it right.
Let's take another short break and talk about our final sponsor, and that's BQE. They are an AIA Advantage partner, BQE Software, the makers of Archioffice. Archioffice is the only office and project management software designed specifically for architects. It will help you manage people and projects while you focus on designing great architecture. Whether you are working remotely or on-site, Archispeak allows you to monitor the status of your projects and tasks, send out invoices in an accurate and timely manner. Our podcast listeners can get a fully functional 15-day trial of Archispeak at www.bqe.com/Archispeak. So head on over and check them out. So Evan, real quick, I wanted to pick up on, actually, it was you, Neil. You had brought up something about kind of like the responsibility of an intern. And I think this might be, there's two different responsibilities that we have in really trying to make the onboarding process of, regardless of what your educational level, experience level, or whatever is with a firm. And that's one, at the new employee side of the responsibility, and that's asking the right questions and not being afraid to, we were talking about it earlier, it's like, people are afraid to ask questions because they don't want to let people know that they don't know something.
Yeah. And
so they're fearful of asking these questions and not really, they just don't, again, they don't want to let people know that so they need to push themselves into really trying to ask these questions, regardless of what the impression's going to be. Hopefully the impression is really going to be, well, this guy's new here, so he's really asking the right question. And that'll get people to notice you, that you're not just going to do things rogue or renegade. You're going to get in there and actually want to learn things the way of the firm. I mean, I used to ask, I was like, look, you guys are a much larger firm than I'm used to, and I want to do things right. I want to do things the ASG way. I would much prefer to do them and make sure that the project's going to get done right versus doing the project the way I know how to do it, but it may not correspond with the ASG way. So I really want to learn the way you guys do things. And that worked for me, because I was able to start understanding, okay, well, if I have a project that's reaching the next submission level, I need to get it to the QA QC guys for them to review it, to make all of their review red lines and things like that, to get it back to me, to get it prepared for the next step and things like that. Whereas prior to joining the firm, I used to do all of that myself. And so to understand and learn where everything else is coming from, that's the best thing that you can do. Now, on the flip side, the firm side, it's the hardest thing, is because 9 times out of 10, you get a new employee in, and they're like, okay, who's going to take this new guy? Hey, Evan, you're gonna do, the new guy's going to come work with you. And you're like, great, I don't have anything to do. I'm too busy doing this, or I'm too busy doing that, to be able to sit down and kind of onboard, process them into what we need to do here. And so it's a hard struggle. And so firms really need to embrace this standardization of things, or this onboarding process, to really teach them. And regardless, and I think the article that you had mentioned about, basically you're not allowed to touch the project or open anything until you go through this process, needs to be a standard that firms really kind of embrace and push and make mandatory.
Well, realize that it's going to affect the bottom line one way or another. And so you can be intentional about it, right? You can go in there with the intention of training people so that they do things the way that you want them to do, that your way. so that you can be profitable and really affect the bottom line in a positive way, or you can avoid it, right?
Right.
And you can affect the bottom line in a very negative way, potentially. And someone could just be sitting there feeling like they're treading water, not knowing what they're going to do. And I like your approach, Cormac, where you kind of reframed it from fake it till you make it to being the kind of person who wants to do it the right way. And you say that out loud. And I think people respond positively to that.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, hey, they want to learn. They want to do it this way. I'm going to teach them the right way to do it. And I would encourage people to do that, number one, but then also to write down what they find out and share that with other people. Because if it's a struggle in the company, it's got to start somewhere. So it might as well be you starting to contribute to some kind of a document with that information in it.
Well, Cormac, you just described the best way to do that. If you're a new employee or an intern, ask the questions, or at least be amenable to saying, I'm going to come in here. Yes, I have some knowledge, but I want to do it the right way, or the way of this firm. That'll go a long way, because if you come in with the opposite attitude, you're not going to make it there. It's just not going to work out for you. Trust me. I've experienced this myself. So,
and you're going to hate the experience of architecture.
Yeah.
Especially if you're new and you come in and you're like, well, I know how to do this, but I'm just going to sit and stew over people telling me what to do their way and stuff like that. I know how to do it, kind of stuff. And they're just going to hate the profession, and they're going to end up leaving. And it's just because either they or the firm just made it a bad experience. And I don't want to put it on that interns coming in and not doing it, but I think that integrating yourself into first of all, you chose to go work for a firm. So be a part of that firm.
Yeah.
Be a part of that firm from the day that you get hired to the day you decide to leave that firm. Be an active participant in that firm and the success of that firm. Be a part of it. And so ask the questions, do the right thing, get in there and ask them. Even if it's the stupid question or whatever that people say don't exist, well, guess what? Ask it, so at least you don't feel stupid by just sitting around and not doing anything.
Yeah. I think that's a great approach for anyone coming into a firm. And I think as an intern or somebody who's new to a firm, it never hurts to ask these questions. But what I find, and I had sort of this experience just yesterday in my office, is that you can always, if you do have a question about, say, maybe how something is done, come to ask the question with an answer or how you would do it. A proposed idea.
Right.
It's like, I think this is how I would do this. Does that match, say, the office standard, or is this the right way to do it? Because if you just come, there's a message that is sometimes, or that is sent if you just come there and say, I don't understand how to do this. Teach me, tell me. That's one approach. The other approach is, I'm not sure how we do this here. This is how I've done it. Is that the correct way? Right. Or because it shows that you're engaged, you're thinking, you are showing some expertise, and also a willingness to learn. And I think that's a great approach for anybody who's listening. If you're new to a firm, if you take that approach, you'll go far and do well.
Yeah, and even take it a step further and say, if that document or that knowledge base or whatever it is doesn't exist, hey, would you mind if I actually started that up so that this information can be passed along to other people who get hired, right? You don't have to leave it right there. You could actually add value to the company, like you're saying, Cormac, roll up your sleeves, get into making the success of the company something that you can be a part of by offering to start that thing. And it can just be as simple as using Dropbox Paper, where it's a living online editing, or it's Google Docs, or it could be Evernote, or it could be a real wiki software or an intranet, something like that. I mean, it doesn't have to be complicated, but it should be something somewhere. And you could be the person who starts that with a little bit of initiative.
Right.
Well, those are all great suggestions, and I just want to quickly remind everyone that we'd like to thank our episode sponsors. First, we have ARCAT. Check out all the features they offer at arcat.com. We're also sponsored this time by Charette Venture Group. CVG helps design firms grow into strong businesses. Visit them and learn more about how they can help you and your firm grow at charettvg.com. We'd also like to thank BQE Software, the makers of ArchiOffice. ArchiOffice is the only office and project management software designed specifically for architects. Get a fully functional 15-day trial of ArchiOffice at bqe.com/Archispeak. And make sure to visit our website at archispeakpodcast.com for links to our catalog of episodes and to sign up for our newsletter, which includes links to everything we mentioned in the episode. Between episodes, join the conversation on the Archispeak Podcast Facebook page or Twitter. Links to everything can be found at the main site, archispeakpodcast.com. Stay subscribed, and thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.